Hello? Hello? Hang on a sec, let me turn the dubstep off. Okay, welcome back to Paint Like Fiends, episode 4, the episode where we're not painting the model. Yep, you got this far, got it base code, you got it ready for all that fancy shading and highlighting shit, and I'm not going to do it. Instead, I'm going to go back to basics and show a few techniques for colour transitions which form the basis for shading and highlighting. I'm going to do this in a very simple way on a bit of plastic art here that's been primed and painted with various colour swages. Is swages the right word? Sways? Whatever. And I'm just going to demonstrate on this. Now this will be a larger scale than what is normal for a figure, so it may not be any imperfections will show up quite readily, but it should show the principles of how this all works. So I've got my paints over there. I've also got some pre-mixes here with a little bit of water added, not too thin yet. And I'm just going to do a few different techniques here so you kind of know what I'm talking about. Some of these may need to be sped up, some of them I can do real time. So layering. Layering is when you paint a series of layers on top of each other. They don't have to be particularly translucent. When you paint sort of gradually differing colours on top of each other, this eventually produces a sort of pseudo colour fade. It will be slightly stripy, but the more you paint, the more different layers you paint, the less stripy it will be. If you painted infinite layers, it would be completely smooth. If you paint one or two, there'll be obvious stripes. So it's basically all boils down to how much effort you're prepared to put in. So I'm going to do that first. On this one I've got, this is colour mix, so paint a layer like so. Okay, wait for this to dry. Okay, and we're back. Had to use a hairdryer for that. I'm going to paint the next layer on here. You can see there's a kind of faint boundary. These boundaries will be evident, but there should be enough layers that the overall effect will be reasonable kind of transition. More drying. Another layer until this bit is kind of really exciting. Trying to make the width of the lines left by the previous colour to be approximately the same. I'm also trying to get fairly opaque coats. And these paints are not, they're semi-translucent anyway, so I'm not getting a perfectly opaque coat here. But I think it will still demonstrate the principle. Colour transition on this is fairly abrupt now. I think this is because the mid-green I'm using has more coverage than the dark green, so when the mid-green and the dark green are mixed, the previous layers were more translucent. With this mid-green on its own, it is more opaque, so this covers stronger and the line's more abrupt. In this case, what we could do here is you go back over just to get the effect kind of more suitable, and actually repaint that line in there, and also repaint the darker mix in there. These should now be more opaque than they were previously. See how that works. Anyway, move on to another layer. This is lighter. It's 2/3 of the mid green, 1/3 of the lightest green. You can see this is fairly translucent. Try and put quite a thick layer on all this. Obviously, if you're painting on the model, you don't want the layers to be super thick. You want to build them up gently, steadily, not to obscure the detail. But for the purposes of this, it's more important to get a kind of reasonably solid colour. It's to show the colour transitions rather than to show the actual amount of paint you should be putting on. More drying. And back again, that transition is quite abrupt. This may be that this sort of their particular greens, the lighter the green covers better. So as we get into the lighter greens, they'll just be more opaque and produce more abrupt transitions. But I think the principle will still be. So now we're going to another mix. This should be 2/3 of light green, 1/3 of the mid green. Yeah, I think this is a little bit more opaque. It certainly seems to be covering better. Doing a simple test like this, if you're layering or whatever, a large amount of paint, or a large amount of area to paint on the figure, this could be really useful. You can test it and think, kind of get an idea of what paint to cover and where you need to maybe have a different mixture to produce better results. See that transition from, I don't know how well this will come out from there to there, it's quite a bit smoother. Finally, some pure light green on this. This will be the final one. So, again, the application of paint here is quite shoddy. That's not the important bit. The important bit is just demonstrating how multiple layers can produce an approximately smooth transition. More drying. So there we go. That's the final one I'm going to do there. Now if you look at it, oh my god, in focus that's horribly stripy. Bear in mind this is far larger than any area likely to paint on a model in this. Now if I bring it up to the camera, try and get this right. So this now should be out of focus and you should get an approximate impression of a smooth transition there. This sort of faking, having lots and lots of layers on a smaller area, you would get a reasonable transition, particularly if you play around with the paint mixes to get the optimum blends there. So I'm going to come back in a moment with a different technique. The next method I'm going to attempt to demonstrate here is sort of multiple layering with very thin layers and not much difference in the actual paint colours. This relies on the translucency of very thin down paint to slowly build up the colour. Now this is something that has been termed, there's a guy called Sebastian Archer, known as Automaton on the internet, who produces amazing quality painting. And he described this technique as juicing, because you have the paint consistency is sort of like a juice rather than actual kind of gloopy paints. Although I am no longer a Seb Archer fanboy, because I emailed him asking how he managed to paint his figures. A figure he painted in 10 hours that would have taken me about, I don't know, 50 hours. And I asked him how he did it and he didn't reply, so I've fallen out with him. But the juicing idea, it's as good a name as any for this. Come up with your own name, but I think the principle should be fairly obvious when it's demonstrated. I'm actually going to use a thicker brush than normal because we're using a much larger area. So I've got some of the mid-tone here. It's thinned down. I might even thin it down a bit more. If this goes on too thick, then I'm simply going to start again. So very thin down. I will demonstrate. This is how thin it is, like that. So it's quite opaque on there. Oh, sorry, quite opaque, quite translucent. And I'm just going to apply this, and this will be a very repetitive process of applying it, drying it, applying it, drying it. Now one thing you wouldn't want to do with this is have the paint build up too much. So just going to spread it around a bit. Go back, it's built up slightly there, but just pretend that didn't happen for now. And another thin layer. I'm actually going over the edge here, just don't worry too much about that. already you should be able to see there's a little bit of a fade going on there. I'll keep accentuating that. A little bit too much on there, so it's dragging a bit off. Okay, building up the colour quite nicely here. Not quite halfway. Once we're halfway, I'll start on the lighter green and do the same thing. So there you go. I've got, getting a reasonably good mid colour there. So I'm going to make sure the lighter green, again, is sort of pretty thin. If you see how it goes over that, fairly translucent. How it goes over more mid green, again, pretty translucent. So let's see, this might look a bit weird at first. If it's too much, then I'll just take it off and try again. That looks a bit abrupt, so I'll just quickly, while it's wet, get rid of that and go for another layer of the mid green first, and then extra thin down light green. So it's left a little bit of a mark there, just ignore that. Right, so I'm thinning down the light green even more. Just show my thumb, paint it thinly, not much at all. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so we've got a slight tide mark there. What we do if you were practicing this and trying it on a model is you just maybe mix the colour in between to smooth the transition, or maybe do more of the mid green first. So we're going to try again with this. If nothing else, you'll see like two different areas where this has been applied on this particular bit. Just repeating the process. Say the overall effect on here won't be so good because there's too much of an abrupt transition between the mid green and the light green, but you can see the sort of individual areas should demonstrate how this works. Keeping going, probably nearly there, maybe a couple more of these layers. At some point it will end up as pure pale green, and then we've won. You've won the painting. Okay, I think that'll do. That's nearly the pure pale green. So obviously there was a bit of an error with the transition in the middle, but if you look at the two aspects, you managed to get quite a reasonable kind of colour fade there. Absolutely no blending at all on that. It's just multiple layers built up, and even if I sit back and look at it from about 3 foot away, I can barely see the layers. And imagine this scaled down onto a model. You can produce pretty good effects like this. So I'll be back in a bit. Okay, and we're back. We're actually back again because I did a demonstration of blending and feathering on the final green swathe on here. Recorded a video, tried to upload it to my computer, did something while the file was transferring, broke it, downloaded 5 different photo recovery suites to try and get it. One eventually found it, and it had a file size of minus 2 gigabytes. Actually, it's like a sort of black hole, an anti-video. I couldn't even recover it. I couldn't recover anything else with it because it had a negative size. So I really screwed that one up. So back again to demonstrate proper blending on this. This is wet on dry blending. So you start with a dry base colour, and then you blend a wet, slightly thinned down a wet colour over that. This is not wet on wet blending. You know, when I started painting, it was back in the good old days when men were real men, painters were real painters, and Mike McVeigh ruled the roost, and his term of blending was this wet on dry blending. Wet on wet blending is where you have one colour will be, have a base colour that's already wet with like some drying prolonged, like drying retardant agent in it, and you put another wet colour next to it, and then you kind of smudge the edge quite easily because both colours will be damp. Apparently very effective. I don't really know how to do that, so I'm not going to demonstrate it. The key with wet on dry blending is when you apply the paint, you'll then have an abrupt edge to that, and you use a clean damp brush to feather that edge to smudge and blur the boundary, and you repeat this over several layers applied one after the other. Do so, and that can produce a pretty smooth effect. So hopefully this all makes sense when I demonstrate it. So I've got a colour of paint here, mixture of dark and medium tone. I'm going to apply that all over. Be quite thick, more thick than you'd apply it onto an actual model, because this is obviously demonstrating on a much larger area. Apply that over. Then when you've got the abrupt edge there, get a clean damp brush and just blur the edge of it. Go back and forth at a couple of different angles, like so, and you'll see that'll start to blur. I'm just going to dry that out in a moment. To get a damp brush, some people blend with 2 brushes, one wet, one damp. I find that is a bit too slow. By the time you've dropped one brush, picked another brush up, checked the points all right, the paint you've applied could be starting to dry out, and it could be harder to feather that edge. I tend to just quickly dip the brush in water, suck the excess paint off, and then use that. Sometimes I will actually just suck the paint straight off and just use a bit of saliva to blend. Don't do this, it's not recommended. Paint Like Fiend does not take any responsibility for people who end up in hospital with toxic paint poisoning if you try and do that with enamels or some crazy shit like that. So best way is just clean the brush first and use your mouth to bring it to a point if you need to, or just kind of bring it to a point on a surface. Okay, dry this and then get back. Okay, and we're black there. Back? We're back. I'm as bloody white as chalk, I am. Okay, so we're getting a little bit of a blend there already. Just going to go over it, same principle with some of the mid-green, thin down slightly, not too much. So I'm going to put some of this on. This will look quite abrupt at first, but again we'll be able to feather the edge nicely to remove that abrupt transition. Okay, so there we go, we've got a coat of that abrupt edge. This time I'll just feather it just purely perpendicular, and you'll see that even this way works like that. Just go along the bottom of that, purely perpendicular. It doesn't really matter the direction, it's whatever suits the model, the surface you're on, your brush, how comfortable you are. As long as you keep doing it in a sort of gentle but rapid movement, just kind of smoothing that paint, spreading it around a bit with the damp brush, which will obviously be thinning it as you're doing it, making it more translucent. Next colour, which is a mixture of the mid green and the light green. I've for the purposes of this, I've done one mixture between the dark green and the mid green, and then 2 mixtures between the mid green and the light green, because of the trial and error on here. A bit of trial, quite a lot of error on these, showed that the light green was quite a bit lighter, so we need more transition between the mid and the light. This will be the first of those. Now it turns out I've thinned this paint quite a bit, so I'll do a couple of these doesn't have to be this thin, but it can help. So this time I shall just go parallel to the edge, like so, further demonstrating that it's not about the specific direction, or in this case about the specific diluteness of the paint. It's more about just getting having the paint wet enough to work with and getting a nice smooth motion with the brush, smudging that edge. Okay, since that coat was quite dilute and quite opaque, quite translucent, I'm going to do another coat of the same, a little bit further up towards the light end, but with the same feathering principle on it. So another coat, that's a bit too much paint, so I'll just like that. And then again maybe this time we'll go diagonally, who knows. Diagonally like that, and like so. Okay, next one, this is a lighter mix of the mid green and the light green. I'm going to just apply that like so. This is a little bit thicker paint than last time, but that's okay. As long as we work quickly, you should still be able to feather that edge nicely. Yeah, you can really see the paint thinning out there. Getting a nice fade there. What I'm going to do now, could do another one of those, but what I'll do is I'll demonstrate something. I have to move quickly on this. Paint straight out of the tub, nice and thick, completely the wrong way to work. But again, a demonstration that it's not about the specific consistencies, it's about the way you work with the paint. So here we go. Light green, applying that nice and thickly on there. Oh my god, that's far too thick to blend, you think? No, it isn't. Thin it down. Working with it while it's still wet. Got a little bit of an error there, but even that, let me show you that you can actually still get quite a good transition there. Okay, this time I didn't destroy the video, but the camera did run out of batteries, so I didn't get to properly finish the blending on that bit. But this here is the end result. A little bit rough there from my dicking around with using a fully thick paint, but you can see the transition, particularly on this side, particularly lower down, is pretty smooth. This is actually a lot harsher than it would be on a normal model because we're on a very large surface area here and only using a few blends and using quite a lot of paint on it. On a model where you're dealing with a much smaller area, say you're blending on this section here, you know, a little bit of paint there and a little bit of feathering down, you only need to do it a few times, and on this scale, once you've got the knack of it, it's quite easy to get a smooth transition. Larger areas you need a lot more paint or thin down paint or a lot more transitions. Like here, it's a bit trickier. So yeah, in general, a few things to mention on this, advantages and disadvantages of these methods. The third time I bloody mentioned this. Layering. The advantages are it's a simple technique. You don't need to learn how to feather. You don't need much control over dilute paint. You just paint on as if you were doing a base coat, but paint on increasingly smaller areas on the particular area you're getting the transition on. You don't need to sort of thin down your paints or worry too much about that, although it does help. Disadvantages are you need to mix up a lot of different or have a lot of different shades or tones to make sure you get a smooth enough transition. You need to put on a lot of layers to get any sort of decent transition, otherwise the striping is obvious, and putting on all these layers can thicken up the paint coverage and obscure detail. But it is a simple method, and in certain areas it is the best method to use. The very thin layering or the juicing, the advantages are you don't need to mix as many tones of paint because you're using such dilute layers that a fairly smooth transition even with just a couple of paints, because you're only that each layer is very translucent. You can get an overall quite nice effect with that, and you don't build up a thick layer of paint so much because you're using very thin layers. The disadvantages are it can be time consuming. You'll need lots and lots of layers of this. It can be a bit fiddly if it's a complicated area of the model. The thin layer starts flowing into the recesses. And the blending and feathering method, the advantages are you have a lot of personal control over what you're doing, because you're actually controlling the edge of the transition by smoothing it, by smudging it, by feathering it. So you can control how much you do that. You don't need as many different tones, because you're using that feathering to blend them, and you can combine it with the other methods quite easily. You can do a bit of layering and then decide, okay, that layer's a bit harsh, I'll then kind of feather that. All of this is quite helpful. It's a versatile technique, it combines with all the other techniques. The disadvantages are you need to learn how to get the feathering right. I mean, I've done it sort of fairly comfortably on here. You do need to pick up how damp the brush should be, the direction you do it in, etc. And it does kind of build up a fair amount of paint. You've got to get paint sort of thinness kind of right, otherwise if you have it too thick like I did here, you can still blend with it, but it'll build it up, it'll be a little bit more lumpy and what have you. But for me, this is my my kind of go-to method, because it is versatile. You can do a little bit of feathering, you can do a lot of feathering depending on the area you're on. And this has demonstrated it kind of long-winded way over one area, but even just like a little bit of paint on here, put a little blob of paint on like that, damp brush, smudge, you re-damp the brush like that, you can get quite a good fade, as simple as that. So imagine that applied more directly to the model, it can be pretty useful. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do some sped up demonstrations on a bright colour, a light colour, while we're fading to dark, and a metallic colour, and these I will do mostly with the kind of blending and feathering, maybe mixing other techniques as suitable. I find with these, blending and feathering is the kind of default, but the other techniques you kind of mix and match depending on the area, depending on the contrast of the paints, etc. Okay. Okay, back to normal speed. This will be the last layer I'll put on these. So this is obviously a kind of crude estimate of what it would be like doing it on the model, but hopefully you should see how it works in a variety of different colours here. Variety of thicknesses, etc. Sometimes you'll kind of feather the edge a lot. Sometimes you only need to do a little bit. Even this, you can bring this right the way up and decide. Get a little bit more purple in it there. The metallic one was done kind of a while ago. I demonstrated doing a sort of black and metallics as well. A good principle when painting metals is to avoid putting too much metallic pigment in the recesses, because naturally metals in the recesses, they don't reflect as much light, so you don't get to see the metallic nature so much, while on the outer surface, if it's sort of nice and bright and reflective, that works quite well. So there you go, some examples of blending. And next time we'll do it on the model. Oh my god.